The chamber fell silent, then erupted into something almost unheard of: applause. Not a smattering, not the polite tapping reserved for ceremonial occasions, but a thunderous release that seemed to shake the very walls. In that moment, time itself felt suspended, as if centuries of rigid protocol had cracked under the weight of something larger than decorum: truth, recognition, and unfiltered respect. Senators shifted in their seats, staffers leaned forward in disbelief, and viewers watching from afar were struck by a simple, inescapable question: what had just happened? This was not the kind of room where raw emotion usually spilled into the open. Applause here was rare, almost forbidden, a breach of the unspoken rules designed to keep passion at bay. Yet on this day, restraint buckled. The chamber, often an arena for bitter divisions and rehearsed speeches, was suddenly united in a single instinct. They weren't clapping for formality. They weren't clapping because they had to. They were clapping because they couldn't hold back. And at the center of it stood a name that had become synonymous with fearless confrontation and unwavering dedication: Jasmine Crockett. She hadn't been the one speaking at that instant, but her presence, her relentless voice, and her refusal to bow to arrogance were the true reasons behind the eruption. The applause was for her, for the battles she fought when the cameras weren't rolling, for the dignity she carried when others tried to strip it away, for the justice she defended even when it came at personal cost. Brian Schatz, steady and measured, had invoked her name with a clarity that sliced through the fog of politics. His words didn't just fill the chamber, they electrified it. The way he spoke, deliberate and unwavering, transformed a routine moment into something cinematic. Crockett's name became a rallying cry, echoing through marble halls and into living rooms across the country. What led to this? What chain of events built toward a breaking point so powerful that even the stiff traditions of Congress couldn't contain it? And why did this moment, this breach of formality, leave the nation buzzing for days afterward? The answers begin not with the applause itself, but with the forces that made it inevitable. The applause had barely faded when the weight of the moment began to sink in. This was not happening in a vacuum. It came against the backdrop of one of the most toxic and polarized climates in modern political memory. The air in Washington had been thick with partisan theatrics, hearings twisted into performance art, sound bites engineered for outrage, and a steady rhythm of attempts to silence or belittle those who refused to play along. It was a season defined by arrogance masquerading as authority, where truth-tellers were shouted down and decorum became a weapon wielded against those who dared to speak boldly. In this storm of cynicism, Jasmine Crockett stood her ground. Night after night, she had shown a kind of resilience that wasn't loud for its own sake, but sharp, deliberate, and unshakable. When opponents tried to talk over her, she did not shrink. When condescension dripped from their voices, she matched it with precision and clarity that left no doubt about her command of the facts. For many Americans watching, she wasn't just another member of Congress. She was their proxy, the fighter in the arena who carried the voices of those often dismissed, marginalized, or ignored. In her, they saw not just representation, but resistance. That was what made Brian Schatz's intervention so powerful. In the rigid hierarchy of Congress, House members and senators often move in separate orbits. For a senator to rise and single out a representative is unusual enough. To do so in celebration and affirmation is almost unheard of. Schatz's voice cut through the partisan fog to validate not just Crockett's argument, but her very place. In the fight was as if the Senate itself, so often portrayed as aloof, insulated, detached, was compelled to acknowledge a rising force in the House. It wasn't simply about flattery. It was about legitimacy. In that chamber, his words elevated Crockett from a single fighter to a symbol of something much larger. Justice refusing to bow to arrogance. Truth refusing to yield to manipulation. To the progressive audience, to immigrants watching there, struggles reflected in hers, and two young people searching for authenticity in politics. The moment felt like a breach in the dam. Someone inside the system had not only noticed Crockett's fire, but chosen to amplify it. And yet, beneath the thunderous applause and the flash of validation, there was more at stake than a simple tribute. Because Schatz's words did more than honor Crockett. They challenged the entire culture of dismissal that had tried to diminish her. They declared implicitly, that the days of underestimating her were over. That recognition carried consequences. It would ripple through the halls of power, unsettle those who thrived on arrogance, and embolden those who believed dignity still had a place in American politics. But this was no ordinary gesture, because the stakes behind those words went far deeper, reaching into old wounds, rivalries, and a looming confrontation that would soon test every ounce of Crockett's resolve. From the very beginning of her tenure, Jasmine Crockett found herself up against more than just policy disagreements. The true adversary was something deeper, harder to name, yet instantly recognizable: arrogance, dismissiveness, and the systemic silencing woven into the very fabric of power. It wasn't always a single figure standing in opposition, though. Faces came and went, but rather an entrenched culture that thrived on condescension. The archetype of the villain wasn't just one person. It was the smirk across the aisle when she spoke, the constant interruptions designed to throw her off balance, the insinuations that her presence in the chamber was somehow less legitimate than others. These tactics were as old as politics itself, a raised eyebrow suggesting she didn't belong, the mocking tone disguising fear as humor, the endless attempts to drown her words in procedural noise. Each instance was meant to remind her of the hierarchy, to enforce the unspoken rule that some voices were meant to dominate, while others were expected to fade. But Crockett never faded. She sharpened. There were clashes where opponents openly ridiculed her. One called her passion overwrought, dismissing the urgency of her words as though they were mere theatrics. Another sneered at her legal background, questioning her ability to interpret the very laws she had practiced with precision for years. In hearings, she was interrupted so often that viewers began to count, and those tallies circulated online as evidence of the double standards she endured. Each attempt to undermine her credibility was met not with retreat but with fire. Rebuttals were crisp, her delivery unwavering, her command of facts undeniable. The irony was rich. Every time someone tried to belittle her, they amplified her instead. Clips of her standing tall against dismissive interrogators went viral. What was meant to silence her only widened her audience. What was meant to erode her legitimacy only reinforced her strength. And as the cameras rolled, something remarkable began to happen. Viewers who once tuned in with indifference found themselves drawn to her, inspired by her unwillingness to bend. But beyond the headlines and viral clips, there was a personal toll. Night after night, she bore the weight of not just representing her constituents, but defending her very right to be taken seriously. Still, she never let that weight bow her shoulders. She carried it with dignity, using it as fuel. If the villain archetype was arrogance, then her counter was resilience. Where others wielded dismissal, she wielded persistence. Where they tried to silence, she spoke louder, clearer, with even greater conviction. Those battles, small in isolation, accumulated into a larger story, a story of endurance in the face of systemic silencing. And every clash, every insult, every calculated interruption became part of the forge that hardened her resolve. Very forces designed to weaken her had instead created a figure impossible to ignore, and that resilience would set the stage for the moment when applause would defy protocol itself. Before Jasmine Crockett's name echoed through the chamber, before applause shattered the walls of protocol, there was a journey defined by grit, sacrifice, and an unshakable sense of duty. Long before she stepped into Congress, Crockett had been sharpening her tools in the crucible of the courtroom. As a lawyer, she made her reputation not by taking the easy cases, but by standing with those who had nowhere else to turn. The marginalized, the overlooked, the people whose voices rarely carried beyond the four walls of a hearing room. Her colleagues would remember the way she worked those cases, long nights poring over documents, chasing down details others dismissed as unimportant, showing up for clients who had been told again and again that they didn't matter. For Crockett, justice was never abstract. It was a mother trying to keep her family together, a worker fighting for dignity, a young person facing a system stacked against them. Every case was a reminder that the law wasn't just statutes on paper. It was a living force that either crushed or uplifted real people, that grounding in the law became her foundation. She saw firsthand how arrogance in the system could suffocate those without power, and she swore she would never become complicit. When she entered politics, she didn't bring the polish of a careerist. She brought fire. Her speeches weren't rehearsed performances. They were extensions of a lifetime of fights waged in smaller, quieter arenas. That raw authenticity drew people in. It also painted a target on her back. But Crockett was never one to shrink from standing alone. In fact, some of her most defining moments came when she chose silence from her peers over complicity with injustice. In the House, when others calculated political risk, she calculated moral cost. Again and again, she stepped into the line of fire with a steadiness that unsettled her opponents. Expected a politician who would bend under pressure. Instead, they found a fighter whose resolve only deepened. Her work ethic became legendary among those who knew her closely. Staffers told stories of lights still burning in her office long after the building had emptied. She reviewed testimony, line by line, anticipated the tricks of her adversaries, and rehearsed not for sound bites but for substance. Those late hours weren't about ego. They were about being ready when the inevitable attacks came. And they always came. What set Crockett apart was not just her preparation but her dignity. Even when she was mocked, even when she was unfairly dismissed, she carried herself with composure. For audiences watching at home, that composure was magnetic. People recognized themselves in her. The worker talked down to by a boss, the student underestimated by a teacher, the immigrants sneered at for their accent. Crockett became a mirror of resilience, showing that dignity could not only survive humiliation, but transform it into strength. Her rise to Congress was not a coronation, but a battle. Every step was uphill, every victory hard-earned. And yet, those struggles built the very qualities that would later define her presence on the national stage. She didn't enter the chamber as a career politician hoping to climb the ladder. She entered as someone forged in the relentless fires of advocacy, carrying with her the stories of those who had been silenced by the time Brian Schatz stood to invoke her name. Crockett had already become something larger than herself. She wasn't just a representative from Texas. She was a symbol of persistence in the face of arrogance, a reminder that even in the most cynical times, integrity could still command attention. Her journey from late nights in the courtroom to electrifying confrontations in Congress wasn't just personal history. It was proof that courage, once ignited, could not be contained. And it was this very story that Brian Schatz would spotlight, sparking an eruption that no rulebook could contain. The chamber on that day was already vibrating with tension, the kind that makes every cough, every shuffle of papers feel amplified. The agenda seemed routine, but everyone in the room understood the undercurrent. This was no ordinary session. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, as if the walls themselves expected sparks. As Jasmine Crockett took her turn, the familiar pattern unfolded. Opponents, unwilling to engage with the substance of her words, leaned on the tired tricks they had perfected. One tried the art of interruption, cutting across her sentences with procedural quibbles meant to derail her flow. Another delivered a smirk-laden remark, tempting to reduce her points to emotional theatrics rather than carefully argued truths. Yet another deployed the slow, deliberate shake of the head, a silent dismissal designed to erode her credibility. In the eyes of those watching, but Crockett, as always, did not flinch. She did not rush, did not allow frustration to crack her composure. Her voice held steady, every syllable deliberate, her precision slicing through the haze of posturing. She parried the interruptions with pointed clarity, her rebuttals carrying the weight of both logic and lived experience. The chamber might have been bristling with arrogance, but she carried herself as though anchored to something deeper, a quiet conviction that justice was on her side. Observers leaned forward. The longer she held her ground, the more the contrast sharpened, opponents flailing with dismissiveness, Crockett standing with dignity. What was meant to make her seem smaller only magnified her stature. Each dismissive gesture became a spotlight, illuminating her poise, and in the gallery above, across the Senate benches, Brian Schatz watched closely. He had seen arrogance before, had seen how quickly truth-tellers could be drowned out by sheer volume and procedural maneuvers, but in Crockett, he recognized something else, a steadiness that could not be broken. no matter how sharp the attack. With each exchange, it became clearer to him that the chamber was witnessing more than just another skirmish. It was watching a battle between cynicism and courage play out in real time. As Crockett concluded her remarks, the atmosphere was taut, almost unbearable. Her opponents had exhausted their arsenal of interruptions. Yet she stood unshaken, her words resonating with a clarity that could not be denied. The silence that followed was not empty. It was charged. For someone to define what had just unfolded. Schatz shifted in his seat. He knew the risk of speaking out, of breaking the rhythm of decorum, of stepping beyond the expected boundaries. Between House and Senate, but he also knew the cost of staying silent. Recognition, when deserved, had the power to shift narratives, to puncture the arrogance that thrived on dismissal. Then, Senator rose and the chamber braced itself. The moment Brian Schatz pushed back his chair, all eyes turned. Senators who had been idly glancing at notes straightened. Staffers froze mid-keystroke, and even Crockett's critics instinctively knew that something unusual was about to happen. Schatz was not a man of impulsive theatrics. When he rose, it meant purpose. In this case, it meant the chamber was about to hear something it wasn't prepared for. His voice, calm but firm, cut through the static. There are those who mistake arrogance for strength, those who confuse interruptions for arguments. But what I witnessed today was not weakness met with noise. It was dignity refusing to bend. He paused, his gaze moving deliberately across the room, letting the weight of the words settle. The chamber fell into a hush so deep that even the faint rustle of papers stopped. Then came the name, the spark that would ignite the fire. Representative Jasmine Crockett spoke it with emphasis, not as a passing reference, but as a declaration. Her dedication to justice, her command of the facts, and her courage in the face of constant dismissal deserve not ridicule, not interruption, but respect. For a moment, the silence grew heavier, stretching taut like a wire. Schatz let it breathe. He didn't rush, didn't crowd his words. He allowed every syllable to land, each one a quiet rebuke to the smug smiles and headshakes that had filled the chamber minutes earlier. He went on. If this chamber, if this nation, cannot recognize the value of leaders who carry themselves with such composure, then what does that say about us? What does that say about the integrity of the institutions we claim to defend? The shift was palpable. Senators leaned back, some nodding slowly, others visibly uncomfortable. Those who had smirked at Crockett now avoided eye contact, shuffling in their seats. Schatz's tone wasn't angry. It was surgical. Wasn't attacking personalities. He was dismantling the culture of dismissal itself by elevating Crockett's courage. He exposed their arrogance for what it was. Hollow, performative, weak. In the gallery, a murmur began. Not loud enough to break decorum, but just enough to signal that Schatz's words were resonating beyond the floor. Down below, the expressions told the story. Some faces tightened, forced into neutral masks to conceal embarrassment. Others softened, recognition dawning that they were witnessing something rare. A senator using his platform not for himself, but to amplify someone else. The pacing of Schatz's tribute carried its own rhythm. Tension built with each carefully measured line, as though he were winding the chamber tighter and tighter. Then he released it. This is not about partisanship. This is about integrity. It is about whether we honor those who fight for truth, even when it is inconvenient, even when it is uncomfortable. Jasmine Crockett embodies that fight. The dam broke. First came the nods, then the murmured here, here, and finally, as if the room could no longer restrain itself, the applause. It started small, a handful of hands clapping tentatively, but swelled into a rolling wave, defying the norms of decorum. It was not polite, it was not restrained, it was cathartic. The sound filled the chamber, echoing against the marble, rising into the galleries until it felt less like applause and more like a declaration. Crockett herself remained composed. Though those who looked closely could see the flicker of emotion in her eyes, she had weathered dismissal after dismissal. But here, in this moment, the institution itself was forced to acknowledge what the public already knew. She was not to be underestimated. Across the aisle, the reaction was starkly different. The villains. Of this story, those who had mocked, interrupted, and sought to silence her, now squirmed under the weight of the applause. Some offered thin, awkward claps, their discomfort visible. Others sat stone-faced, arms crossed, as though refusing to participate might restore some measure of control. But their defiance looked less like strength now, and more like insecurity, laid bare. For all their attempts to dominate the stage, the spotlight had shifted irreversibly. Schatz let the applause wash over the chamber, standing tall, but never once claiming the moment for himself. When he finally spoke again, it was with the quiet conviction of someone who had said exactly what needed to be said. If dignity commands applause, then let it be heard. And with that, the chamber roared once more. What unfolded in those few minutes could not be contained within the walls of Congress. Clips would soon race across social media. Headlines would scream about the breach of protocol, and Americans far from Washington would see, perhaps for the first time in a long while, a glimpse of authenticity in politics. But what happened outside the chamber would prove this was more than a single speech. It was a national moment. The applause inside the chamber was thunderous, but what came after was even louder. Within minutes, phones lit up as clips of Brian Schatz's tribute to Jasmine Crockett began circulating. By the time the session ended, hashtags were already trending. Hashtag stand with Crockett, hashtag applause for justice, and hash dignity over arrogance flooded timelines. TikTok users looped the precise moment Schatz spoke her name, pairing it with triumphant music. Twitter threads dissected every pause in his delivery, every flicker of discomfort on the faces of those who had tried to silence her. The response wasn't confined to political junkies. Teachers in classrooms played the clip as an example of composure under pressure. Immigrant families shared it at dinner tables, pointing to Crockett as proof that voices like theirs could not only survive in the halls of power, but command them. On Instagram, beams spread like wildfire, Crockett's steady gaze juxtaposed against the smirks of her detractors, captions declaring, "This is what strength looks like." Audiences didn't just watch, they identified. Too many, Crockett wasn't an abstract lawmaker. She was our fighter, the one who carried the frustration of being talked over at work or ignored in public life. And Schatz, with his calm, unwavering validation, is hailed as the ally every truth-teller deserves. It's not stealing the spotlight, but handing it to the one who had earned it. That dynamic, hero and ally standing against arrogance, resonated far beyond partisan lines. Commentators scrambled to keep up. On cable news, analysts who usually trafficked in cynicism admitted the moment had a raw authenticity rarely seen in Washington. This wasn't staged, one host remarked. This was real, and that's why it's spreading like wildfire. Even late-night comedians, quick to lampoon Congress as lifeless and detached, seized on the footage. But instead of mockery, their punchlines turned into praise. Imagine a round of applause in Congress, not for lobbyists, not for grandstanding, but for courage. The audience cheered, laughing through their surprise that sincerity could actually break through. The ripple effects reached even rivals. Some, begrudgingly, acknowledged Crockett's strength. Others, more calculating, attempted to spin the applause as theatrics. But their words rang hollow against the viral momentum. Every attempt to downplay her only underscored the contrast, while arrogance sputtered, dignity amplified. What made the moment endure was not simply the applause itself, but what it symbolized. In a chamber where dismissiveness had long been the default, where silence often met sincerity, the eruption of clapping hands became a collective act of defiance. It was the system acknowledging, however briefly, that authenticity could not be suppressed. The chamber applause became shorthand for resistance against arrogance, proof that even in the most rigid institutions, truth had the power to break through. For progressives, for immigrants, for anyone hungry to see dignity validated, the scene was more than politics. It was personal. And as the clips continued to circulate, the message grew louder. This was not a moment to be forgotten, but a turning point to be remembered. In the end, the story of that chamber eruption was never just about Brian Schatz or Jasmine Crockett. It was about something much larger, the hunger of a nation weary of cynicism, starved for authenticity, desperate to believe that dignity still has a place in American politics. For months, headlines had been dominated by bickering, grandstanding, and endless attempts to weaponize division. But in that one moment, when applause thundered against marble and wood, the nation glimpsed something different. Respect, unforced and undeniable. It was a reminder that courage speaks louder than cynicism. Crockett had endured every tool of dismissal, interruptions, mockery, arrogance masquerading as superiority, and still stood unbowed. Schatz's words did not create her dignity. They revealed it. They amplified what had always been there, the resilience of someone who refuses to be diminished, no matter how powerful the forces aligned against her. That resilience was what drew people in, what made the applause not just a sound, but a declaration. For Americans watching, the lesson was clear. Arrogance can dominate headlines, but it cannot command respect. Dismissiveness can drown out voices for a time, but it cannot silence truth forever. What unites is not condescension, but recognition. When one leader honors another not for politics but for character, the effect is electric. In that chamber, for that brief but unforgettable moment, unity overcame division. The resonance of the moment stretched far beyond politics. It touched workers who had been overlooked, immigrants who had been told they didn't belong, young people who had been taught that power was out of reach. They saw in Crockett not just a representative, but a mirror, proof that dignity, carried with courage, could shatter ceilings. They saw in Schatz a rare kind of allyship, one that doesn't overshadow but uplifts. And so the applause became more than noise. It became a symbol that truth still matters, that courage is contagious, and that respect, when it breaks through, has the power to echo far longer than cynicism. Applause may fade, one commentator wrote, but the dignity it honors echoes far beyond the chamber. Those words rang true for millions who replayed the clip not once, but dozens of times, each viewing a reminder of what America could be at its best. The moral is simple but powerful. When leaders dare to stand with dignity, when allies dare to recognize truth, when institutions dare to break tradition for justice, the ripple effects cannot be contained. Applause fades. But the story of why it happened continues to inspire. Brian Schatz celebrated Jasmine Crockett's dedication to justice. The chamber responded with history. That simple truth is what turned an ordinary day of politics into a moment the nation could not stop replaying. In an institution defined by procedure, silence, and rigid decorum, something broke through, dignity demanding to be heard, courage insisting on recognition, truth rising above noise. This was never just about applause. It was about what the applause meant, that dignity will always outlast arrogance, that truth will always strike deeper than lies, that courage, even when surrounded by dismissal, will always carry further than suppression. Crockett's resolve and Schatz's recognition reminded America of something we too often forget. Justice isn't abstract. It lives in the choices people make, the risks they take, and the voices they refuse to silence. And here's the challenge. What happens in that chamber doesn't stay in that chamber. The echo depends on us. If you believe in voices like Jasmine's, if you want to see more moments where courage cuts through arrogance and truth triumphs over the games of power, then this is your call. Subscribe, share, and join this movement of dignity and justice, because applause may fade, but the fight for truth never does.